In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Caramel. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this thing. Here is a very red, orangey leaning brown. Makes it a little confusing depending on what pen you put it in to start with. Now there's a lot of tone variation and decent shading, which I really do like. I just wish it wasn't so red leaning. More brown in certain pens though. This is not an aggressive at all ink on paper and is very well behaved in pens. So it does have a lot going very well for it. I can't say that I would really go to buy a bottle of this, but not that it's bad, just that it's not brown that I tend to look for personally. Besides, I have a couple brown inks that I really tend to go to much more than any other. So my not going for this isn't anything against the ink, it's just off a little bit in the tone that I would want. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Kaweco Brass Sport with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, keep in mind it's a little drier writing pen. Now we get no feather, we get no spread, we get a much lighter tone, and with the lighter tones coming, you see a lot more of that very red lean of this ink. It shades very well. You really do see shading show itself very frequently throughout the writing. I'm just held at the lighter tone, which is showing off the red. Looking at the broad nib, quite a bit darker. Darker as a red, but also when it shades, and we'll talk about it, we get much more of that brown tone. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, and I already spoiled it. It does shade, and when it shades, I think it looks especially nice. The darkest areas of it really stand out. I do kind of wish I got much more of the dark. Like in the word Frederick, if it could be like that with just a little bit more shading, it would be perfect. It's just a little off. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it generally is a little bit lighter than we had with the broad. It's not feathering, not spreading, it is shading. It's shading very well, but it's shading from much more of a red area. The squeegee motion of that nib on the paper is bringing out the red, and if it was a red, it would be doing it beautifully. But it's a brown, so it's showing its base colors. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back there. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A Kaweco Sport with a medium nib. A Kaweco Sport with a broad nib. A Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, which, remember, writes a little drier, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. There's only hints of shading throughout. Not very much, but it's definitely there. The L in Euler is a little bit darker. The H in had, a little bit darker. The K in kept. The R and N in Russian on the second line, it does have the shading. So it does show up. It also shows mostly as a red. Looking at the broad nib, the most noticeable thing, I have to start with it, is the feathering. There is a lot of feathering all over this writing, fairly consistently. I'm not sure that I can find too many spots without it. It's not spreading, though, but let's keep in mind this paper is not made for fountain pens. It does shade. It shades, I want to say, better than it did with the medium, and it looks very nice. It's sparingly placed. Looking at the stub nib, it is light, like the medium was. That squeegee motion working against it, exposing its flaws. It feathers. Its spread is very under control, but it does feather almost as much as the broad did. It does shade. When it does it, it's nice. It's mostly looking like a red, which again, I'm seeing as a flaw in this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we see that with the medium, you could easily write back there, but with the broad or stub, maybe not. But there was no bleed through touching the page underneath. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, this looks red. Now, it has looked very red leaning before, but it looks like a red ink at this point. And that is an effect of the tone of the paper as well as the type of the paper. The feathering is almost non-existent. The spread is almost non-existent. The shading does show itself a little bit. You see it in the T of but on the third line. To but T. And on the fourth line, the herd starts darker and gets lighter. Remember, but T. Looking at the broad nib, but T, saying it sounded funny, but now saying it again, it's really graphically gross. And we're talking about a brown ink. Now, this brown ink here, the feathering almost doesn't happen. It is there, the tiniest bit, but barely at all. The spread is well under control. Shading doesn't really happen, but it kind of does. Look at difference in the second line compared to was not directly under it. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it's light, like the medium was. Its feathering is very minimal, but there. Its spread is very minimal, but it's there. Its shading does show itself. You see it in 24 on the top line. You see it in the and past on the top line. So it definitely shows up. But again, this whole page, we're getting much more red than we're getting brown as a result of the tone of the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see There's some ghosting on the broad and on the stub, not so much on the medium. You might be able to use the back of the page if you decided. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we're still getting very much that red tone instead of a brown because of the tone of this paper having a very noticeably negative effect for me looking at this ink. Now, the performance there, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. The biggest thing I want to say that it's happening negatively is a result of the tone of the paper. It's not the ink. So don't use this ink on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, we get a red, much darker than with the medium, but certainly red, not any kind of real hint of brown. That's what I mean with the tone of the paper really affecting it. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. You see it in Euler's. Starts lighter, gets much darker at the LE and lighter at the R and dark into the S. Look at 13 right next to it, how much it shades in and out just in that one word. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it's much lighter than the broad, kind of like how the medium was. It's not feathering, not spreading. It's shading really well, as there's a heavy peppering of shade throughout a bunch of this writing. Still very much showing up as a red ink, result of the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no ghosting, so no problem writing on the back, and we had no bleed through to the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Delta Brown. Here is Geherban Lit de Thé. Here is Noodler's Rome Burning. Here is Sailor Riku Cha. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we're still very much getting that red with this tone of the paper. Very light, very faded. It almost looks like a sun-faded red. Now, performance-wise, it's not feathering or spreading. It is offering some shading. It can. The shading that it gives is very gentle, very little. Look at on the second line, Painter. Starts darker, works its way very light, darker to the T, light back out, and getting darker at the R. So it does it well. Looking at the broad nib, we are still very much getting a red color with this paper. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's showing that this paper does very well. It is shading. This paper's done so well with this. I'm honestly was expecting this to be just a dumpster fire and have been impressed by this. Steno pads seem to be pretty darn good on the majority. The shading is going very nicely on this ink. I'm sorry I was rambling. I'm back on track. Looking at the stub nib, something strange has happened and it's gotten much darker here. And with the much darker, we get a very dark, rich red that is sometimes a little brown in tone, like was A. The LOR of Taylor, much darker, much more of a brown idea going on there. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're definitely getting shading. Look at formulas on the second line, look at writing on the second line, secretary on the fourth line. Quite nice. Looking at the back of the page, we see that ghosting isn't any kind of a problem. You can easily write back there, and bleeding, there was none. Nothing touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Geherban, their Bouquet d'Antin. Here is a green ink by Diamine, their Soft Mint. Here is an orange ink by Zenzoy, their Juicy Orange. Here is a blue-black ink by Ackerman, their number 7 Queen's Night Blue. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it's red. And we're back on white paper, but it's really showing itself much more as a red. Now, there is a little bit of feathering. I don't think that's the end of the world. There's a little bit of spread that I don't think is the end of the world on this paper. I'm hoping we don't get any bleed through, and I'll say this could be a candidate to use, though not as a brown. It even manages to show some shading. You can see it show itself in tiny dark spots throughout most of the writing. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than the medium. It feathers, yes. It spreads, yes. Is it usable? I don't think so. I wouldn't want to use that with this. I just don't think it comes across very well. It does manage to still show some shading, some spots of it showing up throughout, just not tons. Looking at the stub nib, we say, enter the dumpster fire. There is tons of feathering, tons of spread, tons of general grossness. Problem for the paper, it is darker than we had with the broad. It does show some shading. Now, before we look at the back, I'm going to caution people that frequently the shading on 20-pound copy paper means a lot of bleed. Looking at the back of the page, there was no bleed through touching the page underneath by a miracle. But looking at the back of the page, I don't think you could, because of the amount of ghosting, use it. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The red can show through a bit strong in dry to medium flow pens. I want more of the brown that this ink can get. I get that using very wet mediums or wet broads. You really need a wet pen to put that down and get more ink, really get that brown tone to come through. So while I'm saying wet medium, wet broad, I'm willing to bet a very wet fine would do it as well. The most important part is two things: not yellow paper, it'll turn red, and a wet pen. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.